we might, for example, be talking in 5 years and robots will just be stocking shelves in the supermarket, and it will be a normal or normalized thing, at least, right? Um, so I think in that context, it's really important to talk about these security issues, to talk about the fact that these things are everywhere, and to talk about, as you do, um, the potential for violence, the potential for really actually hurting people on purpose or by accident, of course. We probably shouldn't be unleashing these things on the world, but we're in a deregulatory cycle, to put it mildly, and the executive branch has been very clear about making sure there are no real rules on any of this stuff. So.
Hi, and welcome back to Deep Focus. I'm John Kiriakou. Technology moves at ridiculously fast speeds. I like to think that I'm pretty sophisticated when it comes to tech. In fact, half the time I look like a Luddite, not being able to figure anything out. But I'm lucky to have a friend like Sean O'Brien. Sean is a professor of technology law at Yale University's Yale Privacy Lab, which he also founded, and he's the founder and Chief Executive Officer of ivycyber.com. He's going to help us get through some of these tech issues that are coming up and in the news every single day and actually have an impact on our day-to-day lives. Sean, welcome back.
So happy to be here.
We're happy to have you. Sean, I want to talk at first with you about these developments related to TikTok. Donald Trump declared war on TikTok, essentially. And even Republicans in the Senate summoned the CEO of TikTok, who is not Chinese, but Singaporean, and they grilled him about TikTok's ties to what they call the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. There are no ties to the Chinese Communist Party. That's a red herring. Last time you were on the show, we talked about whether or not TikTok was a danger to the United States or a danger to American kids. It's not, of course, and it doesn't collect any more metadata on users than any American social media platform. With that said, TikTok apparently has been sold to, well, either Oracle or the U.S. government or a combination of Oracle and the U.S. government or whatever. Tell us what's happening with Oracle. What is this deal, and is it important? If it is important, why is it important?
Sure. So, I mean, TikTok is the topic that I think is now a perennial in the headlines, every couple of months. And there's a reason for that, right? This ban, just to give a little bit of history here, because I think it's important, this proposed ban of TikTok, I should say, started in 2024. So with the Biden administration, right? And then TikTok was quite useful to the Trump campaign. And actually, the Trump folks leaned into TikTok quite a bit for their marketing and their campaigning. So when Trump came in this time around, Trump made sure that he at least did a lot of bluster about how he was going to make sure that he was doing a deal and keeping TikTok alive for all the Gen Zers who use it, et cetera, et cetera. There are approximately 170 million US users of TikTok. Many of them, of course, are those key demographics that marketers want, right? There's an enormous amount of data that's flowing through TikTok. So somewhere around, 56 on the low end I've seen to 70% of Gen Z users are using TikTok. And the estimates for the amount of time, the average time that they're using, are somewhere around an hour to, closer to 2 hours, hour and a half each single day. Okay. So enormous amount of data about an entire generation plus, and now my generation, millennials and even, Xers and boomers now are starting to get into the app. So this app is everywhere. It's not going to go anywhere practically. But the reason I'm couching it in this sort of not just timeline, but framework of data is that is the reason we have these discussions about TikTok. This essentially is a data tariff, right? The Trump administration keeps kicking the can down the road of this ban. Now, they've been definitely ordered by the Supreme Court to ban the app. And ostensibly, the reasoning the Supreme Court used back in February was that this was a privacy issue. It's not,
No,
as you
no,
said.
because it's no different than any other social media platform.
That's right. Now, there is an enormous amount of data that's scooped up by TikTok, right? But there's an enormous amount of data that's scooped up by Google. There's an enormous amount of data that's scooped up by Instagram and Facebook and all these other things. And these US intermediaries want to scoop up that data, which right now is going to mostly Chinese owned intermediaries, right? So we're really talking about sort of economic warfare here. And that's kind of why these data tariffs should be put sort of in that context. This is about US rich big tech companies scooping up all that data, monetizing it potentially, probably, and doing it so that ByteDance and the Chinese can't.
Well, let me interrupt you on that
Sure.
point. Should I care? Should I be worried if TikTok knows that I lay in bed every night and watch 20 or 30 minutes of people filming crooked cops and then calling them out? Do I care? Should I care if TikTok knows this about me?
Yeah, so this is one of those things where I usually say, I mean, you don't have to explain to targets why targeting sucks, right? And obviously, you've been targeted and had to deal with the U.S. government coming after you very directly, right? So being worried about the Chinese is not really on the menu, right? You're not
Right.
really too worried
The
about that.
Chinese didn't send me to prison.
That's right. However, I will say, I mean, we have data breaches, right? This data can also have outsized effects. You never really know what these data profiles are or aren't going to do to you down the road. So we don't have the ability, obviously, to predict the future and then look into the past and know what the deal is. I also think, and I know, in fact, when you look at these data flows, that these multinational global corporations are just doing massive amounts of data sharing anyway. So that data that China does scoop up for TikTok, it is going to U.S. intermediaries eventually, right? Maybe in a different form, maybe, and maybe it's not about you watching videos, but maybe it's the time you sleep, right? Trying to guess your movements, trying to figure out your location, those sorts of things, which are problematic. I'd say, location data is kind of the big issue that I worry the most about
Really?
because we're talking about apps on phones, right? These are surveillance devices in our pockets. When these apps are open and even when they're not open, when they're running in the background, they're sending enormous amounts of data about your location, who you're around potentially, often. Um, Whether you're on the phone, the laptop, at work, at school, moving in a car, often they can use like the accelerometer and gyroscopes in the device, which we don't think about as often, these kinds of sensors to figure out some pretty obscure stuff. So it is problematic. But
Well, Sean,
should we be?
I'm
Yeah.
sorry. No, no, finish your thought, please.
I was going to say, I came out obviously against the ban. I
Yeah.
care very much about speech and information flows, right? So even though I know that these apps are, and all these apps, including the big tech apps like a Facebook and so on, I wouldn't want to see a Facebook ban, right? Likewise, I don't want to see a TikTok ban. And, I was part of one of the amicus briefs in 2025 or late 2024 against the ban, basically. So it's really important to me that we have these information flows. And I'd like us to think a little differently about it, right? My team put together an app called StickTok. You know about this, John? StickTok.com. And you can watch TikTok videos using it. You can pop in URLs from TikTok and it will, spit them out. Now, will that app which doesn't spy on people, which is not based in China or the United States, right, which has 100% open source code, will that app continue to work when the TikTok app is sold off or spun out or whatever is going to happen with Oracle and these potentially this Abu Dhabi group and so on start taking over? Probably not. Okay. So if we actually cared about privacy, we could just build our own front ends for the TikTok network that interoperated. Certainly the US government could do this, but they just choose not to. Right.
So TikTok is currently owned by ByteDance, which is a Chinese company. Uh, with this deal, ByteDance is going to retain about 20% of the ownership of TikTok, but the other investors now are going to be primarily Oracle. Larry Ellison being the richest man in the world right now. He's the CEO of Oracle, or maybe he's not. Maybe his daughter is now. I can't remember. But anyway, Other owners are a private equity firm called Silver Lake and a firm that you alluded to a minute ago called MGX Investment Fund in Abu Dhabi. What should we expect to be different between a TikTok owned by ByteDance and a TikTok owned by Oracle and a couple of international investment firms?
Sure. So from a privacy standpoint, there's still going to be baked in surveillance, right? And the only question is who gets that data first, right? Profiles are still going to be built about users. These users are still going to be targeted with advertisements and these other things. That data is going to be sold to third-party data brokers and so on. I tend to be more concerned about US centric firms in this case because big tech, these firms, Oracle and the rest of the so-called Magnificent Seven, Google, Meta, and so on, um, they basically created these techniques, right? They are great at these techniques. They will be targeting users. For example, we've seen targeting of users who are, pro-Gaza, talking about Palestine and other networks. And we've certainly seen an enormous amount of censorship over time. And there are folks who I think rightly so are worried, especially with ICE crackdowns and these other things happening around the country, that we're going to see actual police action from the content that flows through TikTok on Americans that we might not see if it stays with the Chinese company, basically.
I happened to spend this past week in Los Angeles for work. And on Sunday last week, I went to a tech show at one of the big convention centers. There were a couple of things that they had there that I had heard about but had never seen. One were those quadruped, like those robot dogs that you see in Black Mirror that, were killing everybody. And the other was a humanoid robot that it's literally right out of iRobot, the film iRobot. So these humanoid robots are supposed to be in the development process to the point where they can do things around the house. Maybe they can clean your house. They maybe can cook you a meal or bring you your medicine or tell you a story or whatever, right? They're supposed to be human-like. They're humanoid in appearance. But there was a piece out also this week, in fact, just a day before we filmed this interview, saying that these humanoid robots were just recently found to be secretly sending data to China. And they let hackers actually take over the network to the point where hackers can then control the robot. Again, that sounds like it's right out of iRobot and it's not good. Explain to us what we're learning here.
So the first thing I would say is, we should be skeptical of introducing any sort of machine which is connected to the internet to our homes, right? So these robots are extreme examples of that. These were in businesses, right? But still, and are being used for all kinds of purposes. Certainly the robot dogs are going to be targeted for policing and things like that. But the issue is obviously that these so-called Internet of Things devices are connected to the internet, right? Now, just like your home router or your Ring doorbell or the cameras in your home, they can have backdoors, basically. Purposeful flaws, often inserted by the manufacturer, often used to make maintenance and deployment easy for the manufacturer, right? They can have those flaws in the device. They can also have flaws that are inserted purposefully by nation states.
And that's what I was going to ask you next. Yeah.
Yeah.
This wasn't an accident.
Yeah. Well, jury's out. However, we know it had very poor encryption, right? We know that the encryption was trivial to bypass, and we know that it was using BLE, Bluetooth Low Energy, which is in all of these devices. Apple, for example, devices use iBeacon protocol, which is a location tracking protocol, and they all use BLE communication. Those devices have also been pwned as well. It reminds me of Vault 7, which we talk about often. So we'll see what actually ends up, being the end all of this. But certainly, as the warfare, the global warfare heats up, we're going to see more of these devices being backdoored on purpose, being weaponized, purposefully being weakened. And then when those sorts of cyber weapons are created by nation states, they're often released out into the wild by hacking groups or disgruntled workers, so called insider threats, and so on. And they can become cyber weapons that then create all kinds of havoc. So.
You know, this company that has built these robot dogs, I won't call them quadrupeds, the robot dogs and the humanoids, it's called Unitree. The robot dogs are called Go2. These things are not expensive. They're less than $2,000, and they're already being used by big city police departments. They can't be knocked over. I guess they have some kind of gyroscope inside that keeps them upright all the time. And they have little mouths that can actually bite. Now, the mouths are smaller than a German Shepherd's mouth. So if the cops sick a German Shepherd on you, this may be a problem. If they sick this thing on you, maybe it's not going to be as big a problem. But we know how these things go. These robot dogs are going to get bigger and meaner and more sophisticated and more dangerous. When does this end? And let me actually ask you a smarter question. Is there legislation in the offing that is going to regulate these kinds of things, or are we in, a new version of the Old West?
So I have to mention artificial intelligence. I apologize. It's so overused. We're talking about AI constantly, but in this context, it's one which I think we're actually not talking about it enough. Um, Often these robots, and there's some very good examples out there now, are using their own local LLMs. So these large language models, like the ChatGPTs of the world, which folks are familiar with, these robots now have basically their own miniaturized local versions of that. And they're able to accomplish a lot of tasks that we would have assumed robots would have been terrible at not that long ago. For example, some very useful stuff on a factory floor, like sorting things into bins, right? The kinds of things where you would have to build extremely specialized machinery or just have a person do it, right? But robots certainly don't get tired, et cetera. And the idea is they're going to replace an enormous amount of labor. We talked about that separately as well. But these robots do have some complex artificial intelligence brains, so to speak. I hate using that analogy, but they're able to think and act in ways which even a few years ago they weren't. So I think we're going to see a reduction in the cost of these machines as they get more mass produced, as they get more sort of commodified, and we're going to see more usage of them in contexts where we haven't before. We might, for example, be talking in 5 years and robots will just be stocking shelves in the supermarket and it will be a normal or normalized thing at least, right? Um, so I think in that context, it's really important to talk about these security issues, to talk about the fact that these things are everywhere, and to talk about, as you do, the potential for violence, the potential for really actually hurting people on purpose or by accident. Of course, we probably shouldn't be unleashing these things on the world, but we're in a deregulatory cycle, to put it mildly, and the executive branch has been very clear about making sure there are no real rules on any of this stuff. So,
Okay, so let me ask you a follow up to that. There's a piece in ZME Science talking about these things and how they can go wrong. So one of the questions that they pose is about something that researchers tested, and that was when a cybersecurity AI agent runs directly on the humanoid, right, on the robot. It says that using AI-assisted penetration testing, the robot autonomously scanned for vulnerabilities, mapped attack surfaces, and prepared exploits. So they make a point that I think is an important one. This means that the robot wasn't just a victim, right, of a hacker. The hacker hacked into the robot and turned the robot on its owner. But the robot could then become an active participant in cyber attacks, pivoting from reconnaissance, let's say, to offensive operations. It says here, In short, the robot could act as a walking, talking botnet node, infecting networks, spreading to other robots, and feeding stolen data back to remote servers. How can we ensure that that doesn't happen? How can we ensure that these robots can't be taken over, they can't be hacked, and they can't be turned against us?
So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. The first thing I would say is even without artificial intelligence being an issue, right, these robots still would have these flaws, right? They're still going to do unexpected things, just like software has always done unexpected things, just like machines, analog machines have had unexpected outcomes, right?
Yeah,
And so, it's a problem no matter what. But I would say specifically when we're talking about artificial intelligence being used to sort of speed up the supposed utility of these devices or the expected utility of these devices, we have an issue with these models. It's something I teach about called alignment or potentially misalignment, um, where when you ask one of these models for an output, it's always going to give you an output. We talked about it on the last time I was on, right? I used an example of a book report where a kid's just going to ramble off a book report, right? Um, but that's partially because the humans are bad at, and we are in general, in articulating our goals to artificial intelligence, right? So the goal, right, may not have been articulated in the way that we conceive the goal, and yet the machine and the software powering the machine thinks it's met that goal by some sort of criteria. Autonomous cars, we see this problem all the time, right? You would think telling a car to park within certain lines would be very simple,
right.
but it's much easier to teach a human what parking actually means and what acceptable parking means. And we sort of have these predetermined because we have other things going on in our mind about socialization. You don't park too close to somebody else's car because then they're going to open the door and et cetera, right? If you don't talk about all those things, like lay those out, you can have really, really unexpected outcomes when you're trying to reach a goal that a human thinks is simple. So we're going to see, as you talk about, we're going to see sort of, and this is kind of like a dog that's trying to satisfy an owner, right? They're going to really, really, really try to make sure that their owner is happy by doing something, right? But they may do something wacky and not really, do the trick they're supposed to do. Trying to make the owner happy, and yeah, we're going to see a lot of this misalignment basically, and the complexity of the real world. I don't think we're really ready for it. It's hard enough, and we're starting to see, a chilling of people being enthusiastic about AI in the software world on the internet, right? Imagine when we start having these robots walking around, the kinds of damage they can do, the kinds of messes they can make. I think we need to slow down and really put the brakes on it personally.
Hey, Cisco, previously known as Cisco Systems, was in the news a lot this past week, and not for any good reasons. There was an apparent hacking attack that appears to have come from China. Cyber officials in the U.S. government are calling it an advanced attack. Uh, it appears that it's state-backed, state-based, um, and these Chinese hackers or alleged Chinese hackers apparently have been exploiting what we're now hearing were previously unknown flaws in software made by Cisco that are being used in the US government. And the government entity that these hackers hacked was one I've never heard of before. It's called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Tell us about this and why this is so dangerous.
Sure. So first off, CISA basically has an unofficial role in some ways, right? CISA is able to give guidance, but they are not part of the whole enforcement arm of the executive branch. Um, the executive branch ultimately does authorize CISA to do whatever actions it takes, but they sort of have like an advisory role, right? And I know a lot of folks who, they'll talk about CISA reports, or, in the cybersecurity world, we read these reports or have them at conferences and so on. And they talk about basically best practices and that sort of thing. They are one of the agencies, or one of the parts of the agencies that was getting gutted by the Doge
Right.
government efficiency sort of stuff. And now we're seeing, these huge supply chain attacks, essentially, right? Where Cisco hardware, which is, millions of devices that control an enormous amount of the data that flows through the internet, have these what we call 0-day vulnerabilities, which means there's 0 days, right, before the exploit is in the wild, aka in the real world. So this stuff has to get patched now. Um, if you've been running servers, as I do, um, you'll be working upstream with the folks who are touching the bare metal, touching the actual devices. And if they have Cisco devices and they're being responsible, they will make sure that they're patching this and, making sure that it's not a security issue, right? However, most devices on the internet are not very well monitored, right? Certainly, a lot of devices in people's homes aren't very well monitored, and it still takes an enormous amount of effort to patch this stuff. We'll see how bad the fallout is from this. We don't yet have the full story on it, but I can talk about some stories in the past where we've had stuff like this happen. We talked about Vault 7 very quickly, which was back in 2017 when WikiLeaks basically responsibly disclosed information that millions and millions of devices from all kinds of different vendors were purposefully backdoored by the CIA, right? And that whole shenanigan cost who knows how much money, worldwide havoc, all kinds of crazy patching, and who knows how much data actually got stolen by cyber criminals and so on in the meantime. Something similar is happening here. I'm not certain, who the culprit is. I don't think anybody really is. But the way in which it's being handled reminds me of something that's purposefully being sort of held close to the vest by the government. And we've seen that before with Eternal Blue, right? Ransomware, again in 2017, which created WannaCry and all this terrible
I
stuff.
remember
And
that. Sure.
yeah, yeah. Now that was an NSA exploit that was purposefully inserted, right? And we know that for a fact. But at the time, the information sort of came out in pieces like this is coming out. So we'll see how it develops. But whether or not this is something that is part of sort of a backdoor that was purposefully inserted, a so-called cyber weapon, an exploit Cisco didn't know about, which maybe some state actor had something to do with. I don't know. But the fact that Size is making such a big deal out of it and is sort of ringing the alarm, they don't do that very often.
No.
And yeah,
No,
and that's why you're
even
hearing it.
CNN is saying that it's not just us, it's the British too. The British just a week ago warned about a hacking campaign that appears to be identical to the one that Cisco is fighting off right now. But they're saying that while it looks like it came from the same place, i.e., China, that it's more significantly evolved than the last one that the British were subject to, and this came just days after officials from a firm called Mandiant, which is owned by Google, said that Chinese hackers had infiltrated not just them, but U.S. software developers and even law firms to try to steal trade secrets to give China a leg up in its trade war with the United States. And I'll tell you the truth, when I was at the CIA, that's exactly what we would have been doing. Maybe we
Yeah,
shouldn't be surprised that that's what the Chinese are doing.
and we're all collateral damage in
Yeah,
this cyber war.
that's a good point. Yes.
Yeah, exactly right. So, there's been a number of supply chain attacks, but using that term, we could use it for many different types of hacks. In the past couple of months, we've just seen this constant, push for trying to tighten up the trust and the way we think about trust on the internet because of some major hack, right? In this case, we're talking about hardware. Software is a huge issue as well. We saw crypto wallet drainers, as we call them, propagating through the internet in a massive way through JavaScript, something called NPM, Node Package Manager. You know, millions and millions of users, potentially being affected by this software, which without the user's knowledge will try to steal crypto right out of their web browser, right? So if they use MetaMask or one of these, they were specifically targeting these wallets to steal Bitcoin or
Yeah.
Ethereum or whatever.
Right.
And these sorts of, they can ruin someone's life, right? And with Wall Street being so in on crypto right now, the effects are so much larger than they used to be. So we're really seeing Wild West stuff that we haven't seen in a long time. 2017 is a banner year for this stuff. I think 2025 is turning out to be, and potentially 2026, we're going to see really crazy cyber attacks. And I don't know where this is going, but it does not look good to me.
Well, let
Yeah.
me ask you a little bit about that. I don't own any crypto. I used to have a few $100s worth in a Coinbase account. I got rid of it years ago. Then when PayPal started offering crypto, I bought a couple of $100s worth there, got rid of that. So I don't have any. But not a single day goes by, Sean, that I don't get an email, obviously fake, obviously spoofed, saying that my Coinbase account has been hacked. I've lost access to my crypto, and I need to open a new account and send $10,000 worth of Bitcoin to free up my apparently millions of dollars in Bitcoin that I don't really have. I just delete, 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 delete. And then a friend of mine told me just the other day, oh, I would never buy crypto from PayPal. PayPal's not a crypto company. I would buy it from Coinbase. I said, my God, everybody's trying to hack Coinbase. Is there a safe way to buy crypto, a safe way to hold it so that it's not hijacked?
So the original promise of Bitcoin, and should be, in my opinion, the promise of most crypto now, is peer-to-peer transactions, right? Actual decentralized currency that we can store wherever we want to store it in a so-called cold wallet, so that we actually have the keys to unlock that store of value, right? And spend it and send it or whatever we want to do, right? The issue with Coinbase and now PayPal and all the exchanges that are out there is that they're centralized intermediaries just like banks. And just like banks, they often don't have your actual crypto that they're promising you bought, right? So yeah, just like if everybody ran on the banks and tried to cash out from the banks, they
Right.
wouldn't have your
Yeah, the
money because they've
money's not
already.
actually sitting there in the bank.
That's right.
Right.
And now with cryptocurrency, they use sort of a technical excuse often to create, better liquidity, so-called. It takes time, let's say with Ethereum, and something called gas fees with Ethereum, to basically send the currency through the network, right? That's based into the consensus model. It's a really important part of what makes Ethereum work, right? But Coinbase can much quicker just promise you an X amount of Ethereum and then figure it out later, so called. So the real danger there is the danger that we have with banks, coupled with this other danger of now exposing ourselves to cyber criminals in a way which is problematic. Um, I always try to teach people, and we partner with at Ivy Cyber, we partner with Cake Wallet on this. I always try to teach people how to have their own local wallet. Try to learn, even with small amounts of currency, of some token. Monero is the one I always talk about. Try to learn how to keep it and store it securely, privately, and so on. But like anything else, like all the other issues we're talking about, it does take some training at especially right now. We don't have really good solutions that are mainstream yet. I hope to be working on that, and we'll see what happens.
So I mentioned in the introduction that you are the founder and CEO of IB Cyber. I know what IB Cyber is, of course, because we've worked together. But tell our viewers and listeners what IB Cyber is and why it and companies like it are more and more important as we become more and more technologically advanced.
Sure. So Ivy Cyber delivers security education, right? And privacy products. Okay. And vice versa, privacy education and security products, because the two things are very linked, right? So we have a suite of tools, collaboration tools. We're talking about video and text chat. We're talking about, an inbox email like interface. We're talking about a Dropbox like storage interface. And that enterprise suite of tools called Privacy Safe, right? That's our flagship brand, is free and open source software. You can go out there now to privacysafe.app or just go to ivycyber.com. You'll find the link there as well. And you can just download that app and use it. You get strong encryption, right? You get a zero knowledge file system. So on your device, it's scrambled in such a way that nobody's going to be able to crack it. And by the way, you can sync that data to our servers, to your own servers, to, your friend's servers, your company's servers, right? And no one's going to be able to read it either. Okay. We couldn't read it if we wanted to, and that's good for you and it's good for us,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're trying to champion sort of that model. We're trying to be serious about the kinds of advice I've been giving for years via Yale Privacy Lab and just teaching cybersecurity. And the workshops you and I do, John, we've been doing a couple of workshops now. We have an upcoming class that we're launching in November. We want to take basically the training, right? The operational security, the kinds of things you know really well about real world sort of surveillance detection, counter surveillance methods, et cetera, and tying that to real digital solutions. So that's what we're trying to do at Ivy Cyber. And so far, we've made great inroads, right? We're going to be pushing really hard into cryptocurrency and partnering with folks who care about that issue. We're working on some other really tough to tackle problems, such as social media that, doesn't spy on you and things like that. But one piece at a time, and we're getting there. So
I want to go back, if we could, to Cisco. Cisco is such a behemoth in technology. You would think that it would be almost impossible to hack Cisco devices or Cisco systems, no pun intended. But there was a piece in Ars Technica that you flagged for me saying, and this is a developing story, we really don't know which direction it's going. As many as 2 million Cisco devices are susceptible to what's called an actively exploited zero day that can remotely crash or execute code on systems that happen to be vulnerable. Well, these systems that happen to be vulnerable were things like Cisco iOS, Cisco iOS XE, the operating system that powers all the company's devices. How bad is this? How worried should we be that even the likes of Cisco are not immune to a hostile attack?
Sure. So I suppose I glossed over it a little bit, but that's because we're getting so used to these attacks. It's
Yeah.
like, we used to care so much about data breaches, but they're so often now that we just don't talk about them as much. Same thing here. We have serious exploits of this kind, maybe not as big as this, but pretty big, every few months, every few years, and so on. And they're basically because the folks who build this technology, right, have the same issues you have manufacturing any other technology, right? Take, for example, planes, right? Boeing planes, for example. I'll bring up this example. Cisco and Boeing have something in common, right?
Uh-oh.
Well, from sort of a macro sort of analogy standpoint, they both provide technology which generates an enormous amount of commerce, right? The Cisco router itself, right, and all these Cisco routers are pushing tons and tons of data. The lifeblood of our global economy is basically this data now, especially with the investment in AI and so on, right? And the transportation, obviously, people being able to fly around the world has created an enormous amount of international business and so on. Not necessarily the passenger industry itself, but the ability for folks to move freight and so on and so forth, right? But Boeing has trouble still making airplanes that function well, right?
Right. You don't
There's
want them
all
to
kinds of
fall out of the
mechanical
sky.
problems.
Yeah.
Stuff is glossed over. They might know there's errors and purposefully brush it under the rug. Similar things happen with the hardware that runs the internet. And we have to be serious at some point as a society, as a global culture, of saying, we need to test this stuff to the nth degree. We need open hardware where we can actually vet everything down to the silicon, down to the chipsets, right? We need to make sure that we are looking at the software stack, the open source software stack, hopefully. Some of what Cisco ships is open source, but then they have these binary blobs, as we call them, this firmware, which is just shoved in there and nobody knows what it does. By definition, it's a so-called black box system. There's no transparency, right? So testing this stuff is hard. The vendors are overwhelmed. They have other issues, right? Cisco ultimately wants to sell the devices, get them into, wherever they're placing them, and then move on to something else that they're selling, right? And this model to me is not a very good model for us if we care about the internet. We need to talk more about how governments, and you alluded to it a little bit with the app situation with TikTok, but we do need regulation that's more serious about this stuff. We can't just keep treating it like, oh, it just happened to be a model
Right.
car that exploded or an
Right.
airplane that's falling out of the sky. Like for the same reasons, we need to be very serious about this stuff. And I'm just not seeing it. So I expect this to be very bad, as you allude to. I'm worried about it. I take some steps in my own life to make sure that I have the best hardware I could possibly have. But I've been caught on the other end of the sticks, so to speak, as well. I've bought hardware that I find out years later is pwned, and who knows how much of my data, despite all the work that I put in, might have leaked out of there. So it's a huge problem.
Yeah, I mentioned a few minutes ago I happened to be in Los Angeles this past week, and one of the things that I saw were these Waymo cars, right? Waymo. So they're self-driving cars. And there's an app. It's just like Uber. You call a Waymo, the car pulls up to your house. There's nobody in it. And then you get in it and the car just starts driving itself to your destination. I saw dozens of them every single day. And I mentioned to my brother, I said, hey, I'm going to take one of these Waymo cars. It would be so cool, even though it's a little bit weird, it takes some getting used to. He said, no, don't do it yet. They haven't quite gotten it right. And I said, I see them all the time, every day, all over the place. Highway, city, they're all over. And he said, no, a week ago, the Waymo car went down an alley in Venice, California, Venice Beach, and the alley was very narrow. And because people had their garbage cans in the alley, it got confused about the width of the alley. And so when it came up to the garbage cans, it just stopped and it wouldn't go forward or backward. And because the garbage cans were there, the passenger couldn't get out. And they had to call 911. And the cop then called a tow truck to pull it out of the alley so this person could get out of the car. Another thing that it did is it didn't recognize standing water, right? There had been a thunderstorm. There was standing water on a low point on the road. It didn't recognize the standing water. It just barrels into the standing water, water splashing everywhere, but it wet the engine or the battery or whatever it is. I think they're electric, and just died. So then you're not just stuck in a dead car, but you're stuck in a dead car in a 2-foot deep puddle of water. Are we going to be able to get past these little things, these little issues in the coming months? Or is this something that is more serious and it goes to the design?
So, just as I spoke earlier about artificial intelligence being a problem for robots because of this so-called alignment or missing the goal problem, right? Or maybe we're bad at treating it, the way we should treat it from a strategic standpoint, right? Our prompting strategy, you would say, is bad for like a chat GPT, right? There are essential ways where there's going to be issues with artificial intelligence, right? We can get better, right, at the strategies of the way that we sort of talk to it, program it, so called. But ultimately, these are probabilistic systems, right? If you ask an artificial intelligence LLM, generative AI, the same thing twice, you might get something similar, but it's not going to be identical. And if you've ever tried to get these programs to repeat something verbatim, you know how hard that can be, right? For the same reason, there's always going to be these events. And the real question, I guess, these engineers are working on is whether or not those are going to be outlier events, right? Whether they can sort of contain those as outliers. Two things I just want to highlight here, which are about privacy and security, which I think are really important, and really just safety, as you bring up, right? It's funny when you see a Waymo kind of just circling in a parking lot and somebody's stuck in it, but I'm sure when you're in the Waymo and the doors are locked, you're terrified. Right, right. Um, we know that there's going to be accidents on purpose with this stuff, right? We know that these devices are centrally controlled, okay? They're extremely powerful devices, cars, obviously, and they have computer systems which are remotely dialed into by operators if they want to. That already should give a lot of folks pause, especially if they're worried about surveillance in their own lives and targeting and so on and so forth, right? Um, the second thing I'll say about it is that we basically, when we first had automobiles in general, and we were designing roads around automobiles. We retrofitted in the beginning, right? We just kind of had automobiles on the same roads that we had people just kind of walking in, and all kinds of trash in the road and cobblestone and horses. And it took an enormous amount of effort, standardization internationally of different rules and so on, all kinds of what we would call regulation. And that's like a dirty word now, regulation, right? Before we got to the point where it was safe enough to have cars on the road. Just throwing these things in the mix right now, these autonomous vehicles, is going to be a disaster. And I think that's why they're using them in places like Las Vegas, where, certain things about Las Vegas, especially the way it's spread out, it's a tourist city and so on. They're able to do things there right now, which they can't do elsewhere. But I think most importantly, and the sort of freaky stuff, which relates back to these Bluetooth robots, which are able to, for example, determine location or spy on your Wi-Fi and so on, it might be in your home or in your business. These Waymos use something called LiDAR, right? And that LiDAR technology maps the entire environment around you, okay? So that can be replayed, that can potentially be stored, right? You can do object recognition in ways in which traditional video surveillance does not. It's very good at finding anomalies, right? That's kind of the way it works. So instead of just having a raw video feed, all the time, it looks at objects that are in the way of whatever the goal is, driving the garbage cans in your example, right? Those anomalies could be protesters. Those
Yeah, right.
anomalies, yeah,
Good
could
point.
be an individual, right? And then you can even do time-based playback of anomalous events they're talking about. So now that you have Meta glasses doing so-called augmented reality, they're talking about tying those to file systems that are really good at storing LiDAR type temporal data and then replaying. So you put on your Meta glasses, you look at the scene around you, and you replay people moving through that scene 3 hours before, right? So what kind of weird policing, Minority Report style stuff are we going to start seeing? Philip K. Dick kind of stuff are we going to start seeing with the combination of all these technologies being implemented with no democratic control? And that's the thing that really scares me about all of it.
Sean, last question for you. We talk all the time about how people involved with these tech companies are some of the smartest people on the planet. And in fact, here in the United States, at least until the last couple of weeks, we've tried to recruit Indians, Indian nationals, Chinese nationals, people who have these areas of expertise to come and work in the United States. Are you as confident with the level of expertise in the government among the people whose job it is to protect us from hacks and from foreign technological intrusions?
Yeah, the quick answer is no.
I was
Okay.
afraid that was the case.
That said, I don't want to seem like I'm being anti-government,
Right.
right? I think it's really important to have democratic institutions, constitutional institutions, and so on, that we can have some measure of control over as a population. Some sort of democratic levers, so to speak, right? Um, that said, we've had a brain drain for a very long time in the United States. It tends to get worse over time as we devalue labor. We had just recently what people were starting to call a white collar massacre, right? Where big tech firms were basically shaving off their bottom line by firing tons of skilled workers.
Right.
Okay.
Because that's the biggest expenditure for every company is personnel.
Right. But you got to ask, these are $1 trillion companies that are being valued at huge, multiples. Why are they doing that? The excuse is they're going to use AI to just
AI.
replace these folks.
Yes.
Right. We'll see. And I think this H-1B stuff is very similar. We saw similarly with the Doge stuff where they thought they could just take an axe to the government and, get rid of all these folks.
Doesn't work that way.
And they're skilled in specific areas, right? If you're skilled in, oceanography or atmospheric conditions and so on, it's
Right.
kind of an issue.
Yeah, it's an issue when Hurricane Imelda is, 700 miles off the coast and it's going to hit, and you don't have anybody working at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration anymore.
That's right. So there's going to be that similar thing happening here with all kinds of technology. And yeah, it's a bit scary. You don't take a wrench to a helicopter, right?
Hmm.
Or if you do, you better really know what you're doing. So.
Sean O'Brien, where can people learn more about what you're doing, and if they need to get in touch with you?
Sure. So please check out ivcyber.com, ivycyber.com. You'll see the classes John and I are doing together. You'll see the apps we're working on, some of the hardware that we're selling, and so on. And then if you want to, and I hope you do, we really need folks to be testing this stuff for free. You can go out to privacysafe.app, APP, and download the apps and try them out, Windows, Mac, or Linux.
Okay, Sean O'Brien, thanks for joining us at Deep Focus. We'll be back with another interview in the coming days. Thanks for your support. See you next time.